the Texas Tribune Festival will celebrate big, bold ideas from the worlds of politics, policy, and beyond. September 22nd through the 24th in Austin. More information at tripfest.org.
Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Jonathan Dominguez, and I'm the president of the UTRGV Student Government Association. I would like to welcome everyone to this Texas Tribune event entitled Serving Hispanic Students in Texas. When it comes to Hispanic Student Success, I am a prime example. I'm originally from Harlingen, Texas, and I'm a proud Latino Hispanic first-generation student who is the oldest son of a hard-working immigrant family. I'm a senior majoring in biological sciences at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley, with hopes and dreams of pursuing a career in medicine after graduating in the fall of 2022. Today's event is taking place at our UTRGV Brownsville campus. I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of our attendees joining us in person and the viewers watching us online. I will now be turning it over to Mr. Evan Smith, CEO of the Texas Tribune, for the rest of today's program. Thank you.
Please give Jonathan a big hand. Thank you. Thank you so much, Jonathan. More important than giving Jonathan a big hand, somebody give him a job. Let's make sure if we accomplish nothing else today that he is employed by the time this event is over at 1 o'clock. Everybody, good afternoon. I'm Evan Smith. I'm the CEO of the Texas Tribune. I want to welcome you to today's event, a conversation about how Texas and higher ed serve and support Hispanic students. Thank you all for joining us in person and the many people watching at home online. Let me tell you, if you're not aware, there was bad weather in Austin and San Antonio over the last 24 hours. Jacob Fraire, our friend, who I'll introduce in a second, who came from El Paso, his flight was canceled last night through Houston. He ended up flying to San Antonio, got in about 1:30 last night, and then drove from San Antonio this morning in order to be here. I myself was worried enough about our flight getting canceled this morning. Turns out it took off, but was worried enough that I left Austin at 5 a.m. and drove to be here. You have no idea how close you were to President Bailey spending an hour asking President Garcia about Megan Rapinoe. That was going to be this event. But fortunately, that was not the case. And here is why. Words I have said many times. It is great to be in the Rio Grande Valley. And it's important enough for those of us in other parts of the state to show respect to this region, to these communities, and to pay attention to the people and the issues that affect the Rio Grande Valley, and whatever it takes, we come. And we have been in this venue on this wonderful campus before. We'll come back again, and so we're absolutely thrilled to be here. It was not in Brownsville, but in Edinburgh, just before the pandemic shut everything down, what seems honestly like a million years ago, that the Tribune was in the Valley for one of our last full-day events. It was a symposium on the future of healthcare. If only we could have known what was coming. 31 months later, I have to tell you, it is so great to be back on the road, and it is especially great to be back here. We at the Tribune have always believed in the importance of events like this one. They are perfectly aligned with our public service mission, now 13 years old, which is to raise the level of civic engagement in Texas and to make the conversation around issues and ideas civil. Civil, imagine that. These are challenging times. Policy debates and political fights are highly charged, more polarized than ever. But we in this room know that the state we love is better when we come together and talk openly and seriously about the things we can agree on and that affect all of us. So I want to thank you all very much in the room and again online for being part of our return to live journalism. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge President Bailey, Patrick Gonzalez, everybody at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley for their generosity in hosting us. They are incredibly gracious. Please give everybody a big hand from UTRGV. Acknowledge them, their hard work. I also want to thank the sponsors of today's event. They made it possible for us to be here as well. The Greater Texas Foundation, Texas Regional Bank, Methodist Healthcare Ministries of South Texas, the Trellis Foundation, Raise Your Hand Texas, RGV Focus, a collaboration with Educate Texas, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Texas Rural Funders, and Bank of America, as well as our media partners KRGV and KURV. Excuse me, give them all a hand as well, please. Here is the drill for today. Our guest and I are going to talk for about 40 minutes, then we'll open up the floor for questions from all of you. 2 microphones here in the front. I bet you will have even better questions to ask than I will. And I'll make sure to work in some of the pre-submitted questions from the many people watching at home and at work and wherever they are today, but online as well. Okay? Now I'm pleased to introduce the good folks who kindly agreed to join us on stage today. Guy Bailey, to my left, was named president of the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley in May of 2014. Previously, he was president of the University of Alabama and Texas Tech University, chancellor of the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and provost and executive vice president of the University of Texas, San Antonio. He's also served on the board of the NCAA and on the executive committee of the Big 12 Athletic Conference. Jacob Fraire is director of Policy and Strategy at the Diana Natalicio Institute for Hispanic Student Success at the University of Texas at El Paso. Prior to joining UTEP, he was the president and CEO of the Texas Association of Community Colleges and vice president for philanthropy at Texas Guaranteed Student Loans. Jacob is chair of the board of directors for the Institute of Higher Education Policy and is a member of the Student Success Advisory Work Group of the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. Finally, Juliet García, a lifelong educator who spearheaded the creation of the University of Texas at Brownsville and then served as its president for 22 years. She is literally living history. The first Latina to be in the top job at a U.S. college or university. In 2011, she helped lead the effort to consolidate UT Brownsville and UT Pan American into UT RGV and to establish a medical school here. She has served on 2 presidential transition teams and chaired the advisory committee to Congress on financial aid. This summer, she was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Joe Biden. I'd say nobody else in the room has that line in their resume. So we are very happy to have President Garcia, President Bailey, and Mr. Fraire here. Panelists, welcome, and I appreciate so much your time. Let me begin with a premise today. Texas says it's an exceptional state. We've all heard the phrase Texas exceptionalism. Texas wants to be first and best at everything. There is nothing exceptional about higher ed completion in Texas. We may make it over the line on other subjects. We absolutely fall short on this one. I've got the numbers in front of me, most recently released by the Coordinating Board on higher ed completion. And those of you in the room who pay attention to this stuff may know that the Coordinating Board tracks entering 8th grade students in Texas public schools through the end of high school and then 6 years out from the conclusion of high school to see what kind of higher ed completion, 4-year, 2-year workforce certificate is achieved. In 2008, the 8th grade class of 2008, 343,000, roughly, a few more than that, students entered the 8th grade. 270,000 of those students graduated high school. 182,000 students entered college, and by the end of 6 years, only 79,661 had completed. That is a 23% statewide rate. Fewer than 1 in 4 complete college 6 years out from the end of high school. And to the topic that we're here to discuss, 31% of white students achieve some kind of higher ed completion, 17% of Hispanic students, 15% of black students. President Bailey, tell me what I'm missing. Why is any of that good news?
It's not good news. It's all bad news. The truth is, if we don't do something about that, we have a bleak future as a state. And when we started UTRGV, our commitment was to change that. We're very fortunate to be in the Rio Grande Valley, where I think there is a valley-wide commitment to education. I think if you look at our public school graduation rates are going up, and that's not true in most of the rest of the state, but they're going up pretty nicely here. Our graduation rates at both 4-year and 6-year level at UTRGV are going up pretty dramatically. They're almost at the national average now. And so I think that, and what that reflects more than anything is the value system of the Rio Grande Valley. We have people who value higher education, our communities, our students, and they've been terrific to work with. We've tried to create a financial model of an institution that helps them graduate and helps them graduate with minimal or no debt.
Well, I want to talk about the finances and everything else that may be contributing in either a positive or negative way to this. Mr. Fraire, you now are in El Paso. You were in Austin for a while, but you're now in El Paso. I looked at the Rio Grande Valley region numbers. The Rio Grande Valley region, actually 23% of Hispanic students achieve some kind of completion versus statewide 23%, but statewide Hispanic students are only at 17%. In El Paso, that's about 21%, so it's slightly below. You have the perspective of somebody who worked with community colleges particularly, which themselves serve a lot of underserved communities and students. Is this a consistent problem across the state, or would, say, the definition of the challenge that we face be different in El Paso, say, from the Rio Grande Valley?
So, Evan, first of all, let me just say thank you for inviting this conversation. I think it's an important conversation in this moment. I want to address both your questions and the question that you asked President Bailey. Certainly, Texas exceptionalism still exists. I think what we have benefited from is we've benefited by double-digit growth in terms of the talent and the population that we have in the state that has in part masked some of these challenges that are underlining. So I really do appreciate you calling out the 8th grade cohort data because it does two things. The 8th grade cohort data allows us to track what I call sort of real Texans. It offsets out people who are moving to the state of Texas from the Midwest, from the Northeast, from the West Coast. It offsets them because we really are following Texas who are here in our public schools. And I think the other thing that the 8th grade cohort data allows us to do is to not point fingers at one segment of education. The responsibility is for all of us, K-12, higher education, workforce, and then certainly policymakers. To your question, this issue is a challenge across the entire state. The 8th grade cohort data does not make any county or any region in the state look better than the others. When you're talking about 1 or 2 percentage points, we're talking about 1 or 2 percentage points still in the 20 and 25 percentile, not in the 50 or 60 percentile.
Right.
And so I do think that this is particularly salient for Hispanic students and therefore to the work of the Natalicio Institute. When you look at further down into that data point and you look at Latino males, for example, that's a 12 or 13% of them who actually get a credential.
Right, it's closer to 1 in 7 to 1 in 8.
And yet when you look at this 2020 census that we all sort of rush out to look at the report, 50% of the growth in Texas was among Hispanics.
And 95% of the population growth in the state over the last 10 years was in communities of color. This is not a question that we can look away from. We have to focus very, very, very intentionally on.
Absolutely.
Right. Dr. Garcia, you have the benefit of so many years of experience at this that you can tell us whether this is a problem that has existed for a while. My sense is this is not a new discussion, but it's one that maybe we're finally beginning to pay attention to.
I think we've always paid attention to it. The question was, how innovative can we be to try and deal with it, not to mask it, but to create institutions that are responsive to the kind of student that we accept here. We could change that tomorrow. Dr. Bailey could decide that for September, I'm not suggesting this, but for September of next year, that he is going to admit only the kind of student that gets into a UT Austin. And you would see our completion rate change dramatically. That's not our intent. Our intent is quite the opposite. So when you look at only one metric to decide whether or not we are doing good with this population, then you miss a lot of the landscape of the important kind of work that we're doing. So I mentioned that just to make sure we keep open the idea of how we measure our success.
Yeah, I wonder if that's the issue. Let's stay with that, Dr. Garcia. You know, in the days that I went to college, the expectation was, and maybe because of my own family circumstances and the geography in which I lived, it was 4 and out. The expectation was you graduated in 4. We know that the idea of a 4-year completion rate today is a little outmoded, right? I remember the namesake of Mr. Fraire's institute at UTEP, Diana Natalicio, 20 years ago or more, talking to me about the local train and the express train. Some students take the local train, some take the express train. Don't focus so much on the journey, focus on the destination.
But beyond that, you're absolutely right. Beyond that, when you take, I remember listening to the provost of UT Austin a few years ago talk about the average income level of the student, was a freshman at UT Austin.
Yeah.
It was $90,000 at the time. That was years ago.
Right.
Ask what the average income level is of our student here in the Valley. So to imagine that they're going to get to the end road at the same amount of time when they have jobs that they have to do, they have parents to take care of, when they have housing and security issues, it is just unreasonable. Our job then is harder. We don't shirk it, but it is much harder. And we're challenging every day those kinds of premises about how do you do it better, because we know it's urgent for the state.
Yeah, Dr. Bailey, this is a really important point. Are we focusing on the conferring of a degree as the goal when actually creating opportunity is the goal, when giving people a larger perspective on the world is the goal, and that piece of paper or that degree is kind of not the point?
Well, I think for a lot of our students, it is a point because it's the pathway to a better life and to a significantly better economic situation, not just for the students, but for their entire families.
So you're prepared to say that completing then is the goal?
I think completion, yes. Think about this. If you go to college 4 years, you don't get a degree, you know, there's a good chance you've compiled some debt, right? And then how do you pay for that debt? How do you deal with that? For many of our students, the degree itself is the key to a future for themselves, for their families. Yes, simply going to college is going to open horizons to you, but think about where we live right now. Think about the level of poverty here. Think about what a college degree can do for students going out of that. So the degree itself is very important, and we focus very much on helping our students get through. And by the way, we do emphasize 4 years. The longer it takes you, the less likely you are to finish.
Right, but if it takes someone 5 or 6 or 7 years,
that's fine too.
Because if you've seen one student, you've seen one student.
That's right.
Right, every student and every family situation is different. Mr. Fraire.
So I would agree with President Bailey, but I would add that it's got to be an and both. We still need more additional access to higher education and the graduation outcome, President, that you talked about. We need and both. If you look at the percentage of high school graduates who enroll directly into college or university right after high school, Texas is lagging the nation by 15 percentage points.
We're behind the national average by 15 percentage points.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In terms of just graduating, in terms of going directly. So we need to address both at the same time. And I agree with President Bailey. We have to make sure that our students who come to our campuses are leaving with a credential, with any credential, but a credential.
Yeah.
In the workplace, to the day, employers still value that credential.
Yeah, I want you to say more about the metrics that we should use to judge whether we're doing a good job or a bad job here. You have the words student success in your title. What does that mean exactly? How do you define student success?
So it's a couple of things.
Right.
When they are on our campuses, it's the experience that the students have that allow them to feel that they belong on that campus. And it's an enriching academic experience, it's an enriching personal experience that allows them to go from semester to semester, from fall to fall, from freshman year to even if it's their 5th year, senior year, all the way to credential. That's important, that trajectory is important. There is a measurement of students who have credit and no degree. In Texas, that number is now north of 3.5 million. These are individuals who came to our respective campuses at some point in their lives, came, earned a semester, earned 2 semesters, and then without a credential. That experience on the campus will allow them to graduate. I think graduation is important for sure. I don't know that I buy the national metrics, first-time, full-time being the only ones that we measure. Dr. Natalicio, you mentioned earlier, talked about our graduation rate. We produce annually more Hispanic graduates than any other HSI. I would like to argue that. I know Dr. Natalicio did. But sometimes it takes 5 years or 6 years for them to do that. Yes, there is an opportunity loss in the economy for those individuals, but at 6 years out, they will have a credential. That's important. And then, Evan, the most recent conversation, which I subscribe to, is a conversation of making sure that there is a job for that individual upon completion of their degree. That's important.
That's a measure of student success.
Yes, sir.
In your own mind, Dr. Garcia.
So one of the things that we're always worried about on campuses is how students are surviving day to day, right? So whether it was pandemic, before pandemic, forget the pandemic, it created greater problems. But before the pandemic, the students still had health issues. This university just got accredited in its health, with your health services in a way that's very unique. So they're providing exceptional healthcare services for students. That's huge, huge for students, because if you're not healthy, you're not going to go to class. Right. What else do you need? And really the question is, what else do we need, what the student need? Given their income level, given their environment, what else do they need to help get to that goal? Because I don't think any of us would argue that that's not the right goal. Of course we want degrees. Right. But jobs is one of them. Not, you said to this young man, somebody give him a job. That's what they need. They need jobs. One year we decided to take all our part-time employees, and remember we got rid of them. We didn't stop right away. We were kind, but we said we're going to change those to student jobs. We created over 400 jobs that year for students. That makes a difference. So the question is, what can I help create on a campus that changes the environment to then propels them toward that graduation?
Yeah, so Dr. Garcia and Mr. Fraire both mentioned the kinds of things that the institutions have to do for students that are not really about classes so much, but it's more about enabling their success by taking a lot of other concerns off the table, right? I'm thinking about Michael Sorrell, who's the president of Paul Quinn College at HBCU in Dallas, telling the story of realizing that a lot of his students, in an address he was giving to the student body, were squinting and thinking they're not going to the eye doctor. And so arranging for every student to have the ability to be seen by an eye doctor and to get glasses if necessary. And you think, is that really the responsibility of the institution? Well, it may be. It may be the responsibility of the institution to provide childcare for students who maybe actually have kids and may be coming back to school later. Like all these wraparound services, Dr. Bailey, are probably necessary given the fact, again, that every student is different and every student's situation may be different. The university has to give them whatever kind of help they can.
I think that's right. You know, Dr. Garcia mentioned the jobs, and that's been a big focus for us. At times when for example, a couple of times we've had hiring freezes, but not for student workers. We always continue to increase that. We've increased their wages. If you don't, those students are working somewhere. Having them work on campus is important. They're building a community of support when they do that. That's the single most important thing I think you can do for our students, is help them work on campus when rather than going over to Walmart or Whataburger or what have you. So.
Generally, there are a number of rural white students who have challenges in the pipeline to higher ed, the same as students from communities of color may. But today we're talking about serving Hispanic students. So is there something specifically about, in your experience, the population of Hispanic students that is different that we need to be more intentional about?
So let me just say at the onset, to answer your question, Evan, that make no mistake about it, Hispanic families value higher education.
Right.
I want to make sure that we're clear on that, because I think that too often is the narrative in which we begin this conversation. But to answer your question, yes, there are lack of knowledge and lack of networks that exist predominantly among Hispanic Americans because they don't have someone in their nucleus unit that has been to a college education. Yes, that's also pervasive among African American students who are first in their college to go to college. But then there's also the issue of culture. We are a very tight family unit. If somebody in a family unit gets sick, or somebody in a family unit loses their job, then there is a responsibility, implicit for sure. No, mom and dad are not calling you up and saying, you need to do this, but it is implicit responsibility to go and take care of that. And so what do? We take a semester off. So what do? We might drop our course load from a full-time to a part-time. And of course, everybody in this room understands the student financial aid. When you go from part-time to full-time to part-time, you lose some of your student financial aid. So yes, there are some elements of our culture that are prevalent in the Hispanic community that might apply to others, but that are much more acute within our families. And I think part of the equation then as an academy, as colleges and universities, is to really understand where the students are at the time that they come to our campuses, to accept them with a really sort of this positive framework that they're coming to us not with deficits, but that they're coming to us with a lot of assets and then build on those assets. And so I think that's the framework that we would ask our policymakers and our legislators to apply. I want to get to the previous question. I know that you asked earlier about the added responsibility of the academy. There's an old tenet in higher education called in loco parenti, which means that the parents bring their children to us, and we then essentially serve as surrogate parents for their children. This is an extension of that. This is a 21st century extension of a loco parenti. Now colleges and universities really are extending themselves and saying, we're not just gonna bring to you and nourish you and give you a student life experience that your parents would want you to have. We wanna make sure that you are successful by taking down as many of the barriers that are preventing you from being there.
Dr. Garcia, I want to ask you the same question I asked Jacob, which is there something specifically about the population of Hispanic students, but also ask you to think about that over time. If I asked you that question 30 years ago, would you have a different answer than you have today?
So my job is to remember the sequence of the three questions that you just asked. So help me here.
I'll get better at this, I promise. We have an hour.
So one of them has to do with a student and the local parenti, because that's a really important point. We recruited volleyball women to our volleyball team years ago, and you recruit chess champions to our chess team. And I remember a couple, husband and wife, coming from El Paso, actually, from Juarez, to deliver their chess student to us. And she said, te la estoy entregando, which means I'm putting her in your hands. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, that's right. She thinks that I'm gonna know everything that's going on in the dorm and in the chess team when they're, se la estoy entregando. They assume if they're bringing their child from Brazil or from Mexico or from, that you are now taking care of their child. So it's a heavy load to embrace. I am a faculty member now, thank you.
Right.
And one of the things that I did during the pandemic, of course, was teach online like everybody else. And I had a student, and I would talk to them about how they looked like online and how important it was to not show up not dressed and, you know, look nice and all of that. So I had a young man.
How'd that work out, by the way?
Well, we worked on it.
Right.
And so I had a young man, and I couldn't hardly see him. He was in a real dark space. And I said, Luis, ¿qué te pasa? Where are you? Why are you not, you know, I need some more light on where you are. He said, ma'am, I'm in a courtyard on campus. It was a cold night. And I said, and he's like freezing. I said, what are you doing in a courtyard at night on campus? He didn't have access to Wi-Fi. And he said, it's okay, ma'am, I'm fine. I have a coat on and I have a cup of coffee. He was willing to sit there for 3 hours almost. And
so he was using the Wi-Fi network from the campus in the absence of one.
It did not work at his home.
Yeah.
And so he had to be adjacent to campus or on campus. So, you know, how do you compare that? Anywhere in Austin, you've got broadband. You wouldn't even think that is an issue. Here it is today, still an issue. We are in the process of going big time into the new world with broadband.
Well, the state has finally come to recognize what we all knew before the pandemic, which is we had an emergency on this and that there was disparity of access.
That's right.
And so you're telling kind of a horrible story
that occurs today.
That occurs in 2022.
Let me one more, the third question.
Please.
I was a student, a married student. I lived in married student housing at UT Austin 100 years ago, but it was still legitimate an example. I had 2 babies. They were 2 and 3 years old, and I was working on the doctorate. That's an uphill climb. If it had not been for married student subsidized housing that was clean and safe, I could never have left my children in the apartments.
So does that, I'm sorry to ask a question for which I don't know the answer because that's always dangerous, but is there still adequate married student housing on these campuses?
On this campus?
On campuses generally. You can call out this campus if you want. He can hear you, you know, he's right here.
There are waiting lists everywhere. How's that, guy?
Right.
Is that good?
I mean, because you call out something that is obviously a factor. Just as broadband is obviously a factor, just as Dr. Bailey, President Bailey, the cost of higher ed is a factor. Just something as basic as the cost of higher ed. And whether higher ed is creating opportunity that is out of reach of the exact students who need that opportunity the most.
You know, you mentioned housing, just 2 things. One of the things we do need here more is more housing, and more housing that's affordable for our students, because when you can live on campus, live near campus, your success rates are much higher, and that helps our students.
What's keeping you, I think I know the answer to this, but what's keeping you from building more housing of the kind that you described?
Well, money, you know.
But in fair, that's the state.
Yeah.
The state needs to provide you with resources in order to, whether it's tuition revenue bonds or whatever else, the state needs to provide you with money to do what you're talking about.
That's true. And of course, you have other priorities you weigh with that. And we have some creative approaches that we'll be announcing pretty soon, I think, to alleviate some of these issues. But it helps enormously. The more students are on campus, the more they build networks on campus, the more successful they are. You mentioned again, I was first generation too, didn't know anybody who'd gone to college. When that happens, there is just a body of knowledge that you don't have access to, informal knowledge, and that creates difficulties for students. We try to provide some of that for our students through a variety of mechanisms, but it's very important. Yep. There's a flip side to this as well. We try, you know, if you think about this, the family is absolutely huge. You're very important. I speak as somebody with 11 grandchildren. So it is absolutely a key thing in the Valley. Hard work, entrepreneurship, those are Valley values. And so what we've tried to do in structuring the institution is look to those values in putting the institution together and build on the strengths that are here. And I think if you do that, there are some unique strengths in our population we can build on to be very successful.
Would you talk, excuse me, first generation at RGV?
Yeah, gosh, that's probably 60+% of our students. And, you know, again, 60+% of our students, probably 63 or 4 are Pell Grant students. Most of those first generation students. And so when you step on a campus for the first time, when I stepped on the Alabama campus the first time as a student, somebody said, "Are you going to join a fraternity?" I didn't know what that was. I never heard it. I mean, the word was unfamiliar. And so there is just kind of an informal base of knowledge that you don't have access to.
Right.
And that's what helps you just makes your journey easier. And so what you have to do is provide mechanisms, support mechanisms for students to help them recreate that. That's why, and working on campus is a great way to build that network.
Jacob, what is UTEP's percentage? First generation.
It's more than 50%. Of first generation, absolutely. We're 85% Hispanic and more than 50% first generation college students. I do want to get to this issue of parents, right? So national data shows that 21% of college students are parent students. That means these are moms and dads who are enrolled, whether it's part-time or full-time, in a college or university. That's the national data. But I think part of the equation, Evan, is that we have a 20th century funding structure for funding public college universities that is not appropriate for 21st century.
Good, let's talk about that, because I do want to turn the focus on whether the economics of this ultimately propel these students forward, and that gets to whether the legislature sees the need to invest and whether these institutions are pricing themselves adjacent to the value of the education that they're providing. What do you think about that?
Well, I think you were asking me, I'm not.
I'm happy for anybody to jump in, because I do think about the way that higher ed prices itself and the way the legislature views higher ed and the way this is funded as an undeniable part of the conversation, right?
I think it's really important to think about that question for this kind of student versus that question for a student elsewhere. So I think that's an important part. It's not to imagine that they're the same. So we know that our students need health care. So they're in the focus in providing health care. We know our students need jobs. They're in the focus on trying to not only jobs on campus, but jobs out in the community, interning and connecting with companies that they'll work for later on. And then the third thing was childcare, because we know so many of our students are single parents and so we provide childcare for our students and for training early childhood teachers. So I mean that you can carve yourself out a niche that is beneficial to the student and to the university to grow its own programs. So I think the more we try to look like in local parentis for a student, we know their needs are there, whether it's transportation, security, jobs on campus, housing. Those are important. We cannot pretend they don't exist. None of us here, all three of us, maybe four of us, all of us went to school probably first generation, right? I know the three of us did. But we made it. And we made it by hook and crook and a lot of help along the way. Now, does the funding match the new population? I think that's a really important question. And it would be a fair question to try and assess to see whether or not that's true. One of the things I wanted to mention also was the 3P, the partnership agreements that you can do with private industry. We have land, but we don't have money to build. Why don't you come on our campus, you build a building, and then we work out a long-term lease arrangement.
Well, I'm assuming that President Bailey, in alluding to things that will be announced at some point, is talking about something that would be creative in that way, because you leverage the public asset in a partnership with a private entity and ultimately provide the students with what you don't have the resources to provide yourself.
That's right. That's right. And housing is probably the most common area for public-private partnerships. You can do that with other things as well. And again, we've done it with other things. But housing is probably the easiest and the one that's most commonly used.
Jacob, I'm happy that we're talking about the non-classroom stuff, but I do want to come back in the last few minutes we have before we go to audience questions to ask you about the pure academic portion. I was remarking to somebody before we started today about remembering a conversation I had with Brian McCall, the former legislator who's the chancellor of the Texas state system, saying that Texas State University in San Marcos had an unusually high retention rate year over year of students of color. And he believed it was because the university had figured out that counseling was everything, that having academic counselors to work very closely with students on a one-to-one basis was a huge factor. Can you talk a little bit about the kinds of things that, just from the perspective of classwork, coursework, grades, and all that campuses can do to ensure this?
Absolutely. So there's a long body of research that has documented for decades now the efficacy in the academic success of students that comes from something called high impact practices. That's experiential learning, that is engaged learning in the classroom, that is undergraduate research, and the like. At UT El Paso, for example, we embody all of the high impact practices into the classroom. So our faculty are actually using high impact practices with the added mindset that students are coming to them with assets. The students are coming to them with assets and they build on those assets. So I think that a scaling of high impact practices in the classroom that really allows a student to experiment with their faculty members and with each other with regards to the learning they're bringing into the classroom is the kind of experience that the students need. And the data tells you those students are much more likely to be successful, not just in that classroom, but in their college experience. I would like to go back to this issue of funding for a second.
Sure.
Because I do think that I think we need to get back to this and both. Yes, we need in the academy more funding from state and federal sources, no question about it. But we also need new ways of how those funds are allocated. I'm going to give you one example. One of the silver lining that came out of the pandemic was that the federal government not just infused substantial resources for colleges and universities across the country, but they infused something called emergency aid. You said earlier that I represented community colleges. Community colleges in Texas received $759 million from the federal government specifically for emergency aid. Emergency aid, many colleges were already using it to help their students with the emergency of the day, but it had never made it into any kind of federal or let alone state policy of how we fund colleges now. I'm hopeful that we might learn from that experiment of those emergency aid and then have that conversation enter how the state now sees it can fund students.
But of course, it's a one-time infusion. This is part of the federal relief funds that came during the pandemic, right?
That's correct. But I think we can learn from that experience and have our colleges then tell what are the successes on the academic side that our students had, because that $200 interruption to their finance no longer prevented them from finishing it.
Dr. Garcia, jump in, and I want to ask you one additional question on this subject.
We started a math and science academy that now is continuing to bloom on this campus. The only other one in the state of Texas was at North Texas State. And they're the only ones that were getting funded for it. And I thought, is it the whole state of Texas doesn't need math and science students? Why can't we have one? We tried several legislative sessions to get one funded, failed each time. So then we said, we're going to carve the money out of our own operating expenses to get it started. And then we're going to treat it like the ADA requirements for a school. I became the superintendent of the make-believe high school so that I could get ADA money so we could run the students through that program. There are ways of doing now. That program should be funded everywhere.
Well, but Dr. Garcia, this is where the cynic in me comes out. By the way, it's not hard for the cynic in me to come out. You know, I'm happy to hear, actually, all of you talk about these creative ways that you borrow and beg and steal. But the fact is, this is important without you needing to borrow and beg and steal. You know, the old line about budgets are moral documents, right? They tell you what you value. The legislature has now bumped higher ed and the Senate side down to a subcommittee. You have the lieutenant governor talking about eliminating tenure from public universities. And higher ed is now down to a fraction of state support versus what it was 25 years ago, to the point that some wonder if it's out of compliance with the constitutional promise to provide universities of the first class. Like, I'm just wondering, am I missing something here? You all are very creative and innovative in the way you're doing this, but should this be so hard, Dr. Garcia?
Well, of course not. I mean, you remember George Kosmetsky? George used to talk about leapfrog. He says, Juliet, don't go the way everybody else goes. You've got to leapfrog. You've got to skip steps in order to catch up with everybody. Yep. So what these schools do are often skipping, they're leapfrogging, trying to get around the current funding, around the current issues, because you're right, it's getting not better, but worse. And that's nationwide, but in Texas in particular.
Right. So I want to go to questions from the audience. We have 2 microphones up front. I want to invite anybody who wants to ask a question to come up to the microphones, and we'll kind of go back and forth for the remainder of our time. I have a couple that have come in from people watching online, and I might actually start with those. President Bailey, I'm going to start with you, if that's okay. Here is a question specifically about, it says, what are the UT-RGV administration's plans to support, it's the Spanish, COBE Spanish MBA program, the MBA Americas program, to continue serving professionals of the Hispanic community in the RGV and the U.S. to continue their graduate studies?
Well, we support all of the programs that have demand, that students demand. So that program is like every other program. We certainly, as long as there's student demand for it, we'll have it there. And if they're, as I said, that's the only limitation to support of that program is student demand.
Right, okay. Gentleman wants to, no, we have, okay. Let me ask another one. Jacob, let me ask this one of you. This questioner is asking what students themselves tell us they need to succeed. In other words, we're sitting up here talking about what we believe in, and experience tells us that students need to succeed. What do we hear from students themselves?
Student tells us that they need to feel like they belong. There's a great voice that comes from our students where, and look, this is not unique to students, because we all, when we come into a setting, into a new environment, to a new climate, if we don't feel that we fit, then we're not going to stay there very long. But students remind us day after day, academic year after academic year, they need to have a sense of belonging in the classroom with our faculty, but also in administration and the staff. The way they need to feel that they are welcome, but they belong there. And I think that voice is pretty prevalent. But students are also telling us that they do have needs outside of the classroom that we talked about earlier, that Dr. Garcia talked about earlier. In the middle of the pandemic, when I was still at the association, we surveyed 35,000 community college students live, and they were telling us that they needed daycare help. They were telling us that they needed bandwidth for internet access. They were telling us that they needed health care. So those—
Many of the things we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Today. And they're still telling us that today.
Right. Do you hear from those students? We'll go to an audience question here in a second. Do you hear from students that it's important for them to look to the front of the classroom or to look to the administration of an institution and see people who look like them? This is something we hear a lot in public ed, that students who come from underserved communities, particularly communities of color, need to see people in teaching positions or in leadership who look like them, so they feel like the people in charge are invested in their success. Is there a version of that in the universities?
Yes, there is, and yes, they do tell us that, and yes, it makes the difference.
Yeah.
Which is one of the reasons, it's one of the bases for when the federal government authorized Hispanic-serving institutions 30 years ago.
Right, we've just passed the 30-year mark.
One of the premise was that these are the institutions that have at least a body of student enrollment that represents who they are, and that theoretically then the faculty and administration also then reflect that body of students. We landed in 25% for some reasons back in 1992, but there is now a new conversation about what should be sort of the true definition of HSIs, but it does include that question that you've asked, Bevan, about to what extent does a university have faculty and staff who reflect the population who you are intending to serve?
Right. And Dr. Bailey, how do you feel like you're doing that here?
Well, first you can always do better. And so we consciously look to hire people who are as much like our students as possible. In fact, we love to hire people with roots in the Rio Grande Valley. And we have a significant portion of our administration that has roots in the valley or pretty close by. Could we do better? Absolutely. And so one of the goals that we also have is to produce the future faculty members, the future administrative leaders. We're doing some things right now that I think will help us produce some we have a brand new higher ed administration degree that will be— In
other words, graduate them and then keep them.
That's right. We'll be offering this free to our faculty and staff to try to cultivate that.
Okay, we have a question right here.
Hi, my name is Jamie Brown Rosas, and I'm with Texas Regional Bank. This question is for Dr. Bailey. I've attempted to ask you this before, in all fairness to you. You didn't have time to answer, but now you do. So I'm a former financial aid counselor and outreach coordinator and recruitment coordinator for UT Austin. So I saw around the state of Texas, I saw students as they matriculated and then talked to them during sort of the retention process. One of the things that I've noticed, what was always an issue, and I think continues to be an issue, growing issue, is mental health. And now, as a part of the business community, I'm interested in knowing, what do you expect from the business community to help mitigate that? And the reason for that is because the students that you're raising, as we talked about, are going to be our coworkers and colleagues.
It's a terrific question, and again, this was an issue before the pandemic, but we certainly saw coming through the pandemic, we need to prioritize this, right?
That's true, and if you've been in higher education for a number of years, you've seen the issue grow really exponentially. And we certainly have a number of resources on campus available to students, everything from hotlines to free counseling to free mental health services. We can do references, referrals. We can do a whole range of things for our students. trying to, again, you're dependent to some extent on students self-referring themselves. I mean, there are only certain things we can do, right?
Do you have adequate resources on campus, or is everything that you would direct people to off campus?
Well, we do have significant resources on campus, but we also have a medical school. So we have the resources both on and off campus and to help. And we're fortunate in that respect.
What I heard the questioner asking is, what can businesses and the community at large do? You have an opportunity to take a free shot at making a big ask here.
Yeah, we'll come up. We'll come up with something for you, Jamie. Right. I guarantee you.
He wants to answer your question now. I believe me.
Let me mention that when I was a student at UT Austin and you got sick, it didn't matter what you got sick of, you always got the same medication, erythromycin. And I remember thinking, is that it? Do you just like hand it out and they'd give me another little bottle, I'd take it home and I'd stack it with all my other ones. And my husband would say, well, did they fix it? And I said, well, I don't know, I'm taking erythromycin. So healthcare, even then, was important. Now it's even more important. The same thing with mental health care.
Question over here, yes.
Hello, my name is Daniela Martinez. I'm a photographer from the Writer newspaper, and we have a question for Dr. Bailey. The question is, the population of UTRGV is around 90% Hispanic. Do you think that because UTRGV is a majority-serving Hispanic institute, the university has to make a different considerations in the way it served the institution, serve the Hispanic population compared to those institutions that have a smaller Hispanic population?
Right, so I'm going to try to paraphrase the question so this is an institution with a 90% or 90% plus Hispanic student population. Do you have different thinking about what it means to serve a Hispanic student population at a school where the population is this heavily Hispanic versus, say, a school where it might be 40% or 50% enrolled?
Absolutely. I like to say we're a Hispanic institution. We have some students here, many who are not Hispanic, but the vast majority, over 90%, are. So everything we do is really geared to our population, and we don't have practices that aren't geared toward them. Now, we think those practices are beneficial for everybody. But if you look at how we have our peer-led tutoring and mentoring, everything we do, the way we do our finances, our financial aid, everything is geared toward our population. So there really is nothing about the institution that's not geared toward it. And that really differentiates us, I think, from Hispanic-serving institution, maybe 25–30% of the population.
Jacob, jump in here and tell us what percentage of the enrolled students at UTEP are Hispanic.
We are 84%.
84%, so similar to RGV.
So I think it's important for us to go back to 1992 when Hispanic-serving institutions first got designated in federal policy. There was a great debate about whether or not the federal government should even create HSIs as a designation. One of the arguments that was made, and just for full transparency, at the time I was working for the Hispanic Association of College and Universities, which obviously has a compelling interest in the space, was that there was research that coming out of behavioral sciences that looked at critical mass. At what point does a body of your population, in this case as a college or university, at what point does a body of your population begin to change the culture and the behavior of that organization? And the research was at 25%. With 1 in 4 of your individuals are of a certain subset of individuals, in this case Hispanics, that you begin to change that. I think now, because we have huge growth among Latino families, we have huge demographic changes across not only the state but across the country, we now have 559 HSIs. So I think to the question, or underlining beyond the question, is how do we now differentiate between an HSI that meets the federal minimum standard versus an HSI that is intentionally designing and working every day in every academic year to serve the Hispanic students that it serves?
And the assumption there is that also along the way best practices are being developed that can and should be shared among institutions that have a 90% Hispanic student enrollment and a 9% Hispanic student enrollment.
There is nothing wrong with the human capital. at HSIs or at intentional HSIs, like you differentiate an important point, or with the Rio Grande Valley students. There is absolutely nothing wrong with the human capital. What we have lacked is opportunities. And whether you look at a physics degree that we had to fight hard for, today this institution is offering a PhD in physics. I remember we got laughed at when we went to Austin to ask for a physics degree. We got laughed at when we asked for a music degree. I mean, extraordinary. Until finally someone on the board, on the coordinating board said, there are musicians. There are people who love music. Get them a music degree. And we got a unanimous opinion. But everything has been a fight. And I just remind us of that. It still is for Dr. Bailey. It still is for UTEP. It is, you know, Diana used to say she was even a time zone away from Austin. That was good sometimes, she said, sometimes not so good. So we are different. We are different in the fact that we have had neglect and lack of opportunity. We're catching up. And the faster we get the resources that we need to apply
you acknowledge you're not there yet.
Pardon?
Catching up, but not there yet.
No, sir, not at all.
But Dr. Natalicio showed all of us that you can do both. The University of Texas El Paso continues to be an open access institution, and 3 years ago reached the R1 Carnegie Research category. You can both be research intensive, to your point about your PhD in physics, and have open access to the community you serve.
We have a question over here, yes.
Hi, my name is Amanda Rocha. I'm a student with UTRGV. As I sit here for this event, I feel very out of place with the audience. I wanted to ask, what can you guys do to make events like this more accessible to students?
The question is, what can you do? I guess, Dr. Bailey, I'm going to direct this to you. What can you do to make this events like this one more accessible to students? Well, maybe hold them when school's in session. That's on us, probably.
Yes,
to be honest with you.
Probably the best thing is, make it hold the thing when it's in session. It's interesting. We've had over 2.5 years where we've really had a struggle to get things that are accessible to students. And so I think what you'll see, we like events like this. We like student involvement. And as we go forward and as we get out of the pandemic, we'll try to make these things accessible to students. But I think our biggest issue today was simply school's not in session yet.
Yeah, we're about a week out. So I've got 2 minutes before we wrap, and I want to ask our panelists one last question, go down the line, starting with Dr. Bailey and with Dr. Garcia. So the legislature is going to be back in January. You know, we in the business of covering this stuff love it when the circus comes back to town. And so they're a few months away past the election, and they'll be back in Austin. What is one thing that the legislature can do in the next session to advance the cause of the conversation we're having today? You get one wish. Now, again, higher ed is now a subcommittee in the Senate. And even though there's $20 or $25 billion in surplus, according to the comptroller, who knows where that money is going to go, if any of it is necessarily going to go to solve this problem. But you get to say, Dr. Bailey, what is the one thing you'd like to see them do?
Shoot, fund the formula fully. If we had the funding formula fully funded, that would help us.
What would it mean for this institution if the formula was fully funded?
Right now, if your family income, if you're a full-time student, your family income's $125,000 or less, and you're a Texas resident, you go to school with no tuition, no mandatory fees.
Right.
We'd raise that thing even more. We could get most of our students through with very little debt. We could increase student employment. Almost everything we've talked about
What should it be raised to specifically? I'm sure you have a point of view about this.
For what we'd like to do is get this to about 150,000, and we cover the vast majority of people in the Rio Grande Valley. I mean, our students, it would be enormous.
Most of your students would go to school for close to free, if that's the case.
That's exactly right.
Jacob, what do you say? One thing.
We have 30 years of data and evidence on the efficacy of Hispanic-serving institutions. I would invite our policymakers at the state capitol to learn from that experiment, learn from how they are having success in the kinds of outcomes that we talked about earlier, and think about whether or not there's an opportunity for the state of Texas to also have HSIs as a catalyst for success for Hispanic students across our great state.
Okay, Dr. Garcia, what is the one thing, I mean, you've seen legislative sessions come and go over the years, right? This is not new for you. Realistically, what do you think the one thing is that you'd like to see?
Aside from you making me sound like a dinosaur.
No. I think you have.
Because you've seen the same thing I've seen.
Wisdom and experience. I do.
But true. Anyway, that's true. Aside.
I think they like you up there a lot more than they like me. What is the one thing you would have them do?
I am on the Texas 2036 Commission, and our studying is to look at data and imagine what Texas will look like in 2036. And I hate to tell you, it's a bleak picture if we don't do better at what our job is, and that is graduating Hispanic students, graduating more students of all kinds from higher education, creating more jobs and more opportunities. Yep. And that goes into highways and then into healthcare systems and everything else. So I would say listen to the data, because 2036 is data driven, and its policies are being suggested and prepared for the legislature. So there are many such recommendations. Let data drive, like Jacob said, let data drive your decisions, not the latest, rumor about something. Use that data and use that money that we've got for just a little while, because we're not going to have that budget surplus very long. And use it in a way that the data shows will have results, and then hold us accountable. That's fine. We've been there before.
I love that. What a great conversation. How terrific it's been to be here. I want to acknowledge Dr. Bailey and everybody again at UTRGV for hosting us, our great panelists, Dr. Bailey, Mr. Fraire, and Dr. Garcia, all of you. Again, a big hand for our folks up here. Thank you. I want to acknowledge the Texas Tribune staff who came from Austin and put a lot of hard work to get this event put together. Thank you all so much, my colleagues, for making this possible. If you are not a member of the Tribune, we'd be happy to have you at texastribune.org. Texas Tribune Festival, September 22nd to 24th, festival.texastribune.org. We will be back to the Valley because we love the Valley and because we believe it's important to come as often as possible. Thank you all so much. We appreciate you.
The Texas Tribune Festival will celebrate big, bold ideas from the worlds of politics, policy, and beyond. September 22nd through the 24th in Austin. More information at tripfest.org.